You're a fossil, Hank. A useless fossil. His voice was loud enough for everyone on the Astoria dock to hear. The air, thick with diesel and cold brine, seemed to freeze. He stood over me, a young captain with a brand new boat and an ego to match, pointing a clean finger while his crew snickered. "Get your dusty gear away from my boat. You're scaring off the investors." The laughter was a physical blow. I saw old friends turn away, their silence confirming my irrelevance. All because I warned him about the sky, a bruised, greasy purple on the horizon that his precious satellites had missed. He sailed out confidently into what his screens told him was a calm sea, leaving me with the weight of his judgment. But nobody imagined what I would do that day. If this phrase made you think of someone, just comment with "I understand." My name is Hank. I'm 52 years old, though some days, the salt in the sea in my bones make me feel 100 years older. My life has been etched by the rhythm of the tides here in Astoria. The Columbia River Bar, they call it the graveyard of the Pacific, but to me, it's always just been home. I served on a Coast Guard cutter out of this very port, spent decades learning the language of the water, a language spoken in the shift of the wind, the color of the sky, and the sound of the waves against a hull. Now, I just do odd jobs on the docks, mending nets, swabbing decks, whatever keeps my hands busy and earns me enough for a hot meal. It's a simple life, but it's mine. Or it was, until the world decided men like me were obsolete. The source of that judgment has a name, Caleb. He's young, maybe 28, with an ego as shiny and new as his boat, the digital tide. He inherited his father's fishing business, but none of his father's humility. To Caleb, the sea isn't a living, breathing thing to be respected. It's a resource to be harvested, a problem to be solved with data and algorithms. And I'm just part of the old scenery he'd like to tear down. He sees my calloused hands, my weathered face, my faded jacket, and he doesn't see experience. He sees a relic, a fossil. It wasn't always a loud public spectacle. Most days it was a quiet, grinding humiliation. I remember one afternoon last spring. He'd just had a new winch installed, a complex piece of machinery with a touchscreen interface. His crew was struggling with it, the lines getting tangled. I knew that winch, the old model it was based on. I walked over, quietly suggesting, "If you ease the tension on the secondary drum, it'll feed smoother." Caleb just glared at me, a cold, dismissive look. He turned to his crew, loud enough for half the dock to hear. "Don't listen to him. What would a deck swabber know about 21st century hydraulics?" He then made me spend the next hour coiling old, greasy ropes that didn't even need coiling, right there in front of everyone. It wasn't about the work. It was about putting me in my place. It was a message: you are beneath me. The snickers from his crew felt like tiny sharp stones hitting my back. I just kept my head down, focusing on the rhythm of the work, letting the familiar ache in my shoulders drown out the burning in my chest. That's how it was, a constant low-grade hum of disrespect that I had learned to live with. But the day it all changed started like any other. The morning air was thick with the usual perfume of Astoria, diesel, cold brine, and the metallic tang of crab pots. I was sitting on a splintered piling, mending a net, the familiar motion of the shuttle in my hands, a small, quiet comfort. The world could change, but a well-tied knot was still a well-tied knot. That's when Caleb and his crew swaggered past, all confidence and loud talk. He was showing off the digital tide to some men in clean, expensive jackets. Investors, I guessed. He held up a tablet, boasting about his state-of-the-art sonar, his satellite weather feeds, his digital charts that could predict the ocean's every move. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't on a screen. It was out west, beyond the breakwater, a subtle shift in the color of the sky, a greasy, bruised purple hugging the horizon. The gulls, usually squawking and fighting over scraps, were flying inland, low and silent. Anyone who spent a life on this water knows those signs. They're older than any satellite. It was a pressure drop sky, the kind that births monsters. I don't know why I spoke up. Maybe I was tired of being invisible. Maybe a part of me, the old Coast Guard boatswain's mate, couldn't stay silent when he saw danger. My voice was rough from disuse. You might want to check the barometer, Caleb. That's a bad sky. He stopped. The whole group stopped, turning to look at me like I was a piece of driftwood that had suddenly spoken. A smirk spread slowly across Caleb's face. He held up his tablet, waving it dismissively. I've got satellite weather, old-timer. Says clear skies and calm seas for the next 12 hours. His crew started to snicker. Your sky reading is about as useful as a sextant in a submarine. He wasn't done. He walked over, casting a shadow over me as I sat with my net. He was close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne, a scent that had no place on these docks. He pointed a clean, uncalloused finger right at my face. You know, he said, his voice rising, projecting for his audience. My dad used to talk about guys like you, men who thought they could read the ocean with their feelings. He leaned in, his voice a hammer blow. You're a fossil, Hank. A useless fossil. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Your time is over. This is a world of data, of precision. He gestured around at me, at my worn-out tools, my old boat bobbing nearby. Now, if you don't mind, get your dusty gear away from my boat. You're scaring off the investors. The laughter that followed wasn't just snickering anymore. It was a full-throated roar from his crew, echoed by the polite, uncomfortable chuckles of the investors. It was a physical blow. I looked around and I saw the other fishermen, men I'd known for 30 years, men whose fathers I'd known, turn away. They busied themselves with their lines, checked their engines, stared out at the water. Anywhere but at me. Their silence was the worst part. It confirmed what Caleb said. In their eyes, I was irrelevant, a ghost haunting the docks. I didn't say another word. I just slowly, deliberately, packed my mending tools. Each shuttle, each knife felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The weight of their judgment was heavier than any anchor I'd ever lifted. He sailed out a few minutes later, his powerful engines cutting a clean, arrogant wake through the bay. Confident in the clear skies his screens promised him, I just stood there, watching him go, feeling the first cold drops of rain begin to fall. Nobody gave a damn about what I knew, but I knew what was coming. If you've ever felt this way, just leave in the comments. We get it. The rain didn't just fall. It was a solid wall of water that hit the docks with the force of a fire hose. The wind wasn't a whistle, it was a physical scream that tore at the tin roofs of the fish processing plants and sent loose crab pots skittering across the concrete like giant metal spiders. 3 hours. That's all it took for Caleb's clear skies to turn into a churning, gray hell. This wasn't a storm you saw coming on a radar sweep. This was an ambush, the kind the old-timers used to talk about. Born in a pocket of atmospheric rage, the technology was too arrogant to see. I stood in the doorway of a small tackle shop, the smell of wet wood and bait mingling with the electric charge in the air. The other fishermen were huddled together, their faces grim, watching the bay turn into a boiling cauldron. Then the radio crackled. It was a burst of static, then panicked shouting from a dozen different boats caught in the sudden fury. And then one voice cut through the chaos, high and thin with terror. Caleb. Mayday, Mayday. This is the digital tide. We've been struck. Lightning strike. All systems are down. I repeat, all systems are dead. The confident captain was gone. This was the voice of a scared kid. Another transmission, broken by the roar of the wind. Blind! The waves are... God! They're huge! We're taking on water! We don't know which way the channel is. We're lost. And then, silence. Just the howl of the storm and the crackle of an empty channel. Every man on that dock knew what that meant. A boat with no power, no navigation, in a squall on the Columbia River bar. It wasn't a boat anymore. It was a coffin waiting for the sea to claim it. No one moved. The Coast Guard cutter was powerful, but it was still a good 20 minutes from getting underway. And in that sea, 20 minutes was a lifetime. They were all looking out at the maelstrom, shaking their heads. It was a suicide run. No one was going out there, not for anyone. I looked at my own boat, the Sea Dog. She was old, her paint was peeling, and her hull was a road map of 1,000 close calls. She wasn't fast, she wasn't shiny, but she was honest. I knew every groan of her timbers, every cough of her old diesel engine. I knew how she'd handle a following sea and how she'd fight a headwind. I didn't think. There was no time for thought, for weighing the odds. A lifetime of service, of pulling men from water that wanted to kill them, just took over. It was a reflex, as natural as breathing. I walked away from the huddle of silent men, their eyes following me. I could feel their disbelief, their pity. The old fossil was going to get himself killed. The moment I stepped onto the Sea Dog's deck, the wind tried to tear me off. The wet ropes were slick and cold in my hands, smelling of salt and diesel. My fingers, stiff with age, fumbled with the knots, but they did their job. My hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from the raw adrenaline coursing through me. I fired up the engine, and its familiar throaty rumble was a small comfort against the shriek of the storm. As I cast off the lines, I could see the faces on the dock, pale blurs in the driving rain. They were all watching, expecting me to fail. The weight of their gaze was a physical thing, a heavy cloak of doubt. But heavier still was the memory of Caleb's voice, stripped of all its pride, crying out for help. I pushed the throttle forward and steered. The Sea Dog into the churning chaos. The first wave hit us like a battering ram, a solid wall of green water that crashed over the bow and flooded the deck, trying to sweep me overboard. The salt spray was like 1,000 tiny needles on my face. I couldn't see a thing beyond the spray and the rain, but I didn't need to see. I closed my eyes for a second and just felt it. I felt the powerful pull of the outgoing tide fighting the storm swell, a deadly dance I'd known my whole life. I could hear the deep, resonant boom of the waves crashing against the north jetty, a sound that told me exactly where I was. My GPS was my gut. My radar was the echo in my ears. This was a language Caleb's screens would never learn. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. My hands were locked on the wheel, my knuckles white, my arms burning as I fought to keep the bow pointed into the oncoming waves. Was I scared? Hell yes. I was terrified. The fear of being wrong, of misjudging one wave, of my old engine giving out. It was a cold knot in my stomach. But the fear of doing nothing was worse. I found them a mile out, being pushed relentlessly toward the treacherous shoals of Clatsop Spit, the graveyard of the Pacific itself. The digital tide was wallowing helplessly in the troughs, a state-of-the-art ghost ship, its crew clinging to the rails, their faces frozen with a terror I knew all too well. I maneuvered. The Sea Dog alongside, a dance of inches in a sea that wanted to crush us both. My small boat bucked and plunged like a wild animal. Caleb's face was as white as the sea foam, his arrogance completely washed away. "Hank!" he screamed over the wind, his voice raw. "Shut your engine off!" I roared back, my voice tearing from my throat. "You're fighting the sea! Let her ride!" I threw them a line, the wet, heavy rope a lifeline between the past and the future. For the next hour, I didn't give orders based on data. I gave them from memory, from instinct. Rig a sea anchor with your pots to keep your bow to the waves. Watch for the 7th wave, it's the biggest in the set. Steer by the loom of the lighthouse. You can just see it between the swells. I was their eyes, their compass, their instincts. I was teaching them a language their computers could never speak. That was when everything changed, and no one ever looked at me the same way again. The journey back was a slow, brutal fight against an ocean that wanted to keep us. With the tow line stretched taut between us, a thick, straining umbilical cord connecting my old boat to his new one, every wave was a potential disaster. The line would go slack in a trough, then snap tight with a groan that I felt in my teeth as we crested the next wave. I wasn't just towing a boat, I was towing a dead whale, a monument to failed technology. I kept my eyes fixed on them, watching how the digital tide responded to my commands. Caleb, standing at his useless helm, looked to me for every move. His face, illuminated by the flashes of lightning that still tore through the gray sky, was a mask of concentration and dawning understanding. "Watch the stern," I'd roar across the churning water. "When she starts to slide on the wave face, you need to counter-steer. Feel it in your feet, not your head." He did as he was told. His crew, who had snickered at me just hours before, now worked with a desperate efficiency, their eyes darting from me to their captain, their movements stripped of all previous swagger. They were sailors now, not technicians. They learned more in that hour about the sea than a lifetime of reading data screens could ever teach them. I had them use their heavy crab pots, lashed together and thrown overboard with a long line, to create a makeshift sea anchor off their bow. It was an old trick, something my father had taught me. It wasn't perfect, but it stopped the boat from wallowing, from turning broadside to the massive waves that would have rolled it in an instant. It kept their nose pointed into the teeth of the storm, allowing me to pull them forward, inch by painful inch. I wasn't navigating by a glowing dot on a map. I was navigating by the faint, pulsing glow of the Cape Disappointment lighthouse, a ghost of a light that appeared for a split second at the peak of each swell. I navigated by the sound of the bell buoy at the channel entrance, a mournful clang that the wind carried in fragments. It was a symphony of survival, and I was the conductor. As we finally cleared the breakwater and entered the relative calm of the bay, the storm's fury began to recede, leaving behind a heaving, exhausted sea, and that's when I saw them. The entire dock was lined with people, fishermen, cannery workers, a few tourists who'd been trapped by the storm. They stood in the driving rain, silent, just watching. Every single person who had seen my humiliation that morning was there. As I slowly guided our two-boat procession toward the pier, a strange quiet fell over the harbor. The only sounds were the chugging of my old diesel engine, the creak of the lines, and the cry of the gulls who were just now venturing back out from their shelter. The whispers stopped. The nervous chatter died. They just stared. I could see their faces clearly now. The old-timers, men I'd fished alongside for decades, had looks of grim, profound respect. The younger guys, the ones who had laughed with Caleb's crew, now looked at the ground, at their feet, anywhere but at me. Their shame was a palpable thing, thick in the air. I brought the Sea Dog alongside the pier, her scarred hull bumping gently against the pilings. Caleb's crew, moving with a new, somber humility, secured their own crippled vessel. Then everything stopped. Caleb stood on the deck of his boat for a long moment, water dripping from his hair, his expensive jacket torn at the shoulder. He looked at his silent, dark screens. He looked at the chaos of ropes and crab pots on his deck that had saved him. Then he looked across the water at me, sitting in the cockpit of my rusty, insignificant boat. He swung himself onto the dock and walked toward me. The crowd was breathless. No one moved. He stopped right beside my boat, looking down at me. He wasn't looking at my face, but at my hands, still clenched around the worn wooden wheel. The same hands he had mocked, the hands of a fossil. They were raw, bleeding in a few spots from fighting the wheel, but they were steady. He finally lifted his gaze to meet mine. There was no arrogance left in his eyes, only a deep, hollowed-out exhaustion and something else, something that looked like awe. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He swallowed hard, his throat working. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, raspy, but it carried across the water to every single person watching. He didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize. He said something far more meaningful. He gestured with his head toward his dead million-dollar boat. "All that data," he said, his voice cracking. "All that technology, it couldn't tell me which way was home." He looked me straight in the eye, and the entire dock heard him say it. The fossil knew the way. He didn't have to say another word. In that moment, In the silent, stunned respect of every sailor on that dock, I felt something shift. It wasn't pride. It was recognition. My worth wasn't a memory. It was a current, as real and powerful as the tide itself. If you've ever proven something to someone in silence, comment, "They understood too late." In the days that followed, the silence on the docks was different. It was no longer the silence of dismissal, the kind that made me feel invisible. It was a silence of deference. Men who used to walk past me without a glance would now nod, their eyes meeting mine for a moment. They'd pause their work when I walked by, as if waiting for me to speak. The change was most profound in Caleb and his crew. I saw them a couple of days later, working on their damaged boat. The investors were gone. The deal likely sunk along with Caleb's pride. His crew, the same young men who had laughed at me, now worked quietly, their movements careful and deliberate. They didn't look at me with fear, but with a kind of cautious reverence. I walked past them, heading for my own boat, and one of them, a kid barely out of his teens, stopped coiling a line. "Mr. Hank," he said, his voice quiet. "That sea anchor trick. My grandfather used to talk about that. I thought it was just an old story." I just nodded. "Some stories are true," I said, and kept walking. Caleb himself avoided me for nearly a week. I didn't expect an apology, and I didn't want one. An apology would have been for him, to ease his own conscience. What I saw instead was more meaningful. I saw him on his boat with a set of old paper charts spread across the console, a pair of dividers in his hand. He was tracing the lines, learning the contours of the seabed, the things his screens had always flattened into 2 dimensions. He was learning the language. One afternoon he found me sitting on the same piling where he had humiliated me, mending the same net. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, shifting his weight. "Hank," he finally said, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance, "the barometric pressure, you said it was a pressure drop sky. My satellite feed said nothing. How did you know?" I didn't look up from my work. I just kept my hands moving, the shuttle weaving in and out. "Technology reads what is," I told him. "It doesn't feel what's coming. The gulls knew. The air knew. The water changes color. The ocean talks all the time. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." He stood there for a long time, just watching my hands work. He didn't offer me a job. He didn't offer me money. He offered me something far more valuable. He asked another question, and then another. He wasn't asking for answers to save his business. He was asking for knowledge to save his life. I became his teacher, right there on that dock. He never called me a fossil again. To him, and to everyone else, I had become something else entirely. I was a library. The sea has a way of stripping you down to what you are. It doesn't care how much your boat costs, what logos are on your jacket, or how loud you can shout. When the waves are the size of houses and the wind is trying to peel the skin from your face, all that matters is what you know in your bones. It's the great equalizer. It rewards experience, and it punishes arrogance with a brutal, impartial fury. I never wanted to see Caleb fail. I never wanted to be proven right in such a terrifying way. All I ever wanted was the quiet dignity of being seen, of having the knowledge I'd spent a lifetime gathering mean something. In the end, it wasn't about me being a hero. It was about a simple, hard truth that this port was built on. When the storm comes, it isn't the man who talks the loudest who matters. It's the one who acts when everyone else is frozen in fear. It's the one who knows the way home when all the lights go out. My life isn't so different now on the surface. I still mend nets. I still swab decks. I still feel the ache of the damp cold in my joints. But the air around me has changed. I am no longer a ghost haunting the docks. I'm a fixture. Young fishermen, guys who look a lot like Caleb's crew, now stop and ask me what I think of the morning tide. The old-timers will share a cup of coffee with me in silence, a comfortable companionship that says more than words ever could. I earned my place back not with a single act of bravery, but but by reminding them of a knowledge they had started to forget. I reminded them that the most important tool on any boat isn't on a screen. It's the wisdom carried between a sailor's ears. But sometimes, late at night, when the foghorn moans its lonely call across the water, I sit in the cabin of the Sea Dog, and I wonder if they truly see me, or if they just see the man who can save them. Do they remember me for what I did, or do they only respect me now because they needed me? Read this ending and comment with one word that summarizes you when you were doubted.